This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 163 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I've got a really special episode today. I had the chance to interview Tony Wheeler, who was the founder of the Lonely Planet guidebook empire. I was lucky enough to meet Tony recently at the conference I went to at the Australian Society of Travel Writers Convention. He was the keynote speaker there. You can hear a bit more about that whole conference experience in episode 160. But in any case, Tony was lovely enough to agree to record an interview for the podcast. And so this is it today. But before we get on to my chat with Tony, I did want to have a little reminisce about my experiences with Lonely Planet, because I remember quite distinctly the very first Lonely Planet guidebook I ever bought. I was 18 to 19 and I wasn't traveling anywhere. I was at uni and, had no money and wasn't even quite sure I had I wasn't really quite brave enough to travel, but I liked the idea to do it, as an adult, I suppose. And the first Lonely Planet I bought was New Zealand Lonely Planet. And I remember very well that I bought it with either birthday or Christmas money that my dear grandmother had given me, my nan. She's the one who's responsible for the entire name of my site for Not a Ballerina. Just go to notaballerina.com/about and you will find that story. Now, ironically enough, I still to this day, decades later, have not been to New Zealand, but I remember having that guidebook and just devouring it and kind of seeing from all of the information inside it, it kind of reminding me all that was out there in the world and all the decisions that I would be able to make in the future as an adult to travel. So that's funny that I remember it so well. I used lots of Lonely Planet guidebooks over the years, especially when I was living and traveling abroad in my 20s. I haven't kept many of them because, decluttering and all, but I have a bunch of them. And my two favorites that I can see on my shelf here are one for Tunisia, because I traveled to Tunisia on a kind of a whim from Slovakia when I discovered that we had a 2-week break over Christmas, not long after I'd started working there. And I chose Tunisia because it was basically the only place that there were flights still available to. And I knew nothing about it, and I learned everything from that guidebook. It completely defined our trip. And my other favorite is the Trans-Siberian guidebook, because it was that, special companion along the Trans-Siberian. And it had sections where you could see kind of kilometre by kilometre what you were passing and how long it would take to get to the next stop, and all of this really cool information. And of course, that was the special trip. So those are my favourites. Now, of course, it must be said that Tony and his wife Maureen sold Lonely Planet a decade or so ago, but continue to have a big interest in travel and obviously have had incredible travels over the years. So here is my chat with Tony Wheeler. Lovely to have you here today, and it was a pleasure to meet you at the ASTW convention a couple of weeks back. Now, my favourite thing about travel is I think we learn so much from it that's really valuable in all parts of our lives. So what have you learned about yourself over the years from your travels?
Well, I've got older, so hopefully I've got more sensible over that time. Look, I think you do all sorts of foolish things when you're younger. And I look back to my earliest travels, and I'm a great believer in young people traveling. I think, that gap year thing, a year of gap year travel, you learn more than your last 5 years at school and your next 3 years at university or whatever. I'm all for that. On the other hand, I was guilty as any other young traveler of penny pinching too much and arguing too hard about prices and so on. And I think later on you think, I would have spent that little bit more money and I've had the better experience. And look, last week I was in Vanuatu, and there was what do you do on Tanner Island? You go and see the volcano, and you might go to a traditional village or whatever. And I thought, well, I'm going to the volcano in the evening. I'll go to the traditional village in the morning. There was nobody else going. There was a minimum of two to go. So, you know, and I thought, hell, I'm not going to be here again. I'll pay for two people. So, you know, but I'm sure back in the day, as they say, many years ago, I would have thought, I'm not paying double for, you know, the single experience. But you get older and wealthier, and you don't worry about those sort of things.
Yeah, that's true. I agree. When I look back on my kind of backpacking days, there are certain things. I mean, it's almost the only kind of regrets I have of any kind of travel, that I didn't take the opportunities that were in front of me just because I thought I was going to run out of money. Because you always find more money somehow, don't you?
You do. And, you know, I think the other thing is, if there's an opportunity, absolutely grab it. I always say that the biggest mistake of my travel life was going to Afghanistan in 72 and not going up to Bamiyan to see the Buddhas. And, you know, if I could turn the clock back, I would definitely turn it back. On the other hand, you know, there were people I met who I wouldn't have met if I, you know, left Afghanistan 2 or 3 days later. Yeah. So who knows? You know, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. But it's also easy with the benefit of hindsight to see, oh, goodness, now Afghanistan is something that, you know, is so different. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I do always remember I was transferred with work to Adelaide for a while. And I spent a month there working very hard and not seeing much of South Australia. And then suddenly things changed and we got moved back very suddenly. And I thought, oh, if only I had spent some of those weekends doing more things. And after that experience, I really always tried to make the most of, because you just never know what twists and turns are coming your way.
You don't. And, you know, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but, you know, it's ridiculous in many ways. I always say that if I could have been somewhere, obviously if I could have gone to Bamiyan when the Buddhas were there, that would have been a thing I should have done, and I had the opportunity. But, you know, you can go back and think, well, I would love to have been there then. And I never went to Berlin until after the wall fell. And I've got lots of German friends who live in Berlin. And, you know, they talk about what it was like being there when the wall came down. Well, obviously, if you could sort of wind the clock back, you think, well, this week I am going to Germany because I think interesting things are going to happen in Berlin. And I would, you know, if I had the time machine, I'd definitely do that.
Oh, imagine. A time machine to bring history to life would just be fabulous.
Yeah. Or the opportunities to bring history to life. Yeah.
Very true. I very fortunately happened to be in Berlin the year after the wall fell, but at the day of reunification, I was at Brandenburg Gate with a host family I was staying with. So that was one of those travel moments that was completely serendipitous, but it really shaped my kind of yearning to do more, to be, you know, the chance of being involved in those kind of moments.
Yeah, absolutely. I did actually do that sort of thing though 2 years ago, because I had to be in the States in November 2016, and I thought, look, I could easily go to the States a week early. And be there when the election takes place.
Wow.
And I thought, you know, it's going to be really fascinating to see the first female president elected, or as it turned out, to see Donald Trump elected. Yeah. So I was there the day that happened. And, I'm very glad I was. It'll be one of those claims, you know, later on. I'll say, well, I was there. I saw
Absolutely.
it. I could have warned them.
Would have been a very interesting time to be there, and surprising.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh dear. Yes, I think lots and lots of things we can learn from travel. Now, I got the idea when you presented for us at ASTW that you have a bit of an interest in transport. So I first want to tell you a quick story. I lived in Bratislava in Slovakia about 15 years ago. And in your presentation, you showed us these graphic pictures of bus accidents that were in, I think it was the Shanghai bus station.
Yeah, they were very Chinese, yes.
Yes, well, it reminded me of this situation I had in Bratislava where, so it was about 2003, 2004, and we took the trams everywhere. You know, I lived near a tram stop and we'd trundle along in these trams. And at some stage, someone told me about their website. And so I went onto the tram website, the kind of transport authority, and they actually had this system there where you could look up from its, I don't know, serial number or something, the exact tram you were riding on or you had ridden on. We didn't have, mobiles in those days. But you could go home and look it up. And it would also, as well as describing, the make of the tram and all those kind of specifications that didn't mean much to me, it also had a detailed history of any accidents the tram had been involved in, including photographs of it, like coming off the tracks or crashing into a car. And so you could see all of the accidents that tram had ever been involved in.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's definitely
fabulous. And I went back and I discovered that site doesn't exist anymore, but I wish I'd screenshotted all of it.
But, they don't offer you this, but you can do that. If you know the registration of an aircraft you're flying on, you can look up its history and see, who bought it originally and who sold it there. And if that had been in any accidents, if it ran off the runway when Lufthansa used to own it. And
oh, my goodness. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Oh, I have to.
So I think, if you're an enthusiast for that sort of macabre information, it is available.
Yes, I don't know. I'm not sure I want to know about the planes, but it's useful in a way. But anyway, back to your interest in transport. What is your favourite way to get around and why?
Oh, look, I used to say, I still do say, but I'm not as good as doing it. I used to say I'd try and do at least a week-long walk once each year. And I must admit, I haven't for the last couple. I still walk a lot. I've done a few reasonable length walks this year. But I haven't done a week-long walk all this year. Santiago de Compostela is still waiting for me. Camino Santiago. But walking is the way to go. You see things at a slow pace. You meet people better. You see towns, entering them and leaving them. If you're walking through little villages in England, for example, walking is a great way of getting around. On the other hand, there's a lot to be said for bicycles, and I have been out on my bicycle once today in Melbourne, and I've got another bicycle trip to do after we finish our phone call.
Oh, fabulous. I just ran an episode a couple of weeks ago with a couple of guys who independently of each other had bicycled across the world, and they really did convince me that it's just the right speed. You can, get places a little bit quicker than walking, but you still get a lot of the benefits of walking.
Yeah, so there's a lot to be said for bicycles. I'm keen on bicycles.
I'm not very keen on cycling around Australian cities, but we were in Copenhagen earlier this year, and I loved that. I had my 9-year-old along with me, and he was, I wouldn't let him ride his bike in the middle of Perth, but in Copenhagen, no problem.
Yeah, that's a cyclist city. It's true.
Yeah, it's awesome. Speaking of kids, now you have a couple of kids, grown kids, but I'm curious to know, do they have the travel bug as badly as you and Maureen obviously do?
Maureen doesn't have the travel bug as badly as I do anymore. She's definitely moderating her travel addiction these days. But I think with my kids, neither of them as bad as me, but my daughter much more so than my son. Both of them travel, and there's no question of that. My son, it's much more when he has to for business. But my daughter does like to travel, and she's looking after a small child now. But before the baby was born, she was helping to run our foundation and did a lot of travel because of that. So she's got a lot of Africa stamps in her passport. Oh,
fabulous. Right. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I am trying really hard to indoctrinate my 9-year-old into this life of travel, and he's so far he seems more obsessed than me. So my plan is that I'll have to follow him around the world if I ever want to see him, which is a great excuse to travel.
Yeah, well, this trip I did to Vanuatu last week, the volcano on Tanna, they said no children under the age of 7. Well, I saw 2 at least who were well under 7, but it was a volcano. It was the perfect children's volcano. Volcanoes in children's books, there's red hot lava and there's things flying up in the air and there's rumbling and groaning, and this volcano had all that stuff.
Wow.
It was a perfect child-sized one.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Yeah, my son will be asking after he listens to this. He'll be wanting to get to Vanuatu. Now I want to just chat about some of your books. So The Badlands was one of my favourite books that you put out. perhaps you can, for listeners who don't know about it, could you just explain what the Badlands were and tell me, is there any big change coming in your new edition, which I read is due?
No, let's take the new edition first of all. I don't know about a new edition. The book, I've actually got a copy of it in front of me right now. It's getting a bit old now. I'm surprised how long it's been since I did it. So I did it first of all in 2007, I think it was, and we did do a new edition in 2010. So it has been revised once, but they haven't told me about any plans for another new edition.
Oh, maybe there's news that's coming soon.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to revise it if they'd like me to. It was really, I say that George Bush made me write it, because when George Bush Jr. said that there was an axis of evil, my first thought was, oh, I want to see that. That would seem to me was a real sort of travel incentive. It was giving you a bucket list to go and tick off immediately. So Badlands really did start with the George W. Bush Jr. Badland list, which of course was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. So that was a 3 good bad places to go to. And I'd been to Iran a number of times previously, but I'd not been to Iraq. So that was interesting. And nor had I been to North Korea. And that was extremely interesting. North Korea is still the wackiest country I've ever been to. But then I just chose a bunch of other countries that seemed bad. Afghanistan, of course. Afghanistan was not the Taliban. I think we have to look at the Taliban from various angles, but certainly Osama bin Laden hiding out there and all the chaos in Afghanistan over the years. That's a bad land. Myanmar, which of course has got worse in recent years. Back then it was 2007. It was the country's really bad for locking up Aung San Suu Kyi, but now we've let her out, and it's really bad because of what she's done. So, Burma. Sadly, it's a wonderful country, but we have to say right now it's definitely on the bad list. Cuba, because Fidel was still alive in 2007, and I think still going in 2010. And of course, the Americans have been dedicated to saying it's a bad country from day one. And you have to ask, just why in some respects. Libya, Gaddafi was in power in those days.
Yes.
So Libya was definitely a bad country. And then what else did I choose? I chose Albania. I think in some ways because I had the opportunity to go there around that time. And of course, Enver Hoxha, the dictator of Albania, was totally nuts. And now the country's bounced back in many ways. And in fact, it's actually got a lot more back on the beaten track in the years since I was there. Albania, which I just found a fascinating country, and a country with a sad story in many ways. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, Saudi Arabia. I put Saudi Arabia in as well. And that's definitely a bad country, and in many ways it's got worse. Back then they wouldn't let women drive, and now they don't let you step through the front door of their embassy without getting your head chopped off. Not a good country in any way you can think of at all. What I did at the end of the Badlands book, I invented my evil meter, and I ran the evil meter over each country, and I gave them points for how bad they were for assorted things, whether they were bad for their own citizens, whether they were bad to neighboring countries, whether they were involved in terrorism, like North Korea definitely was, and then I gave them just a final bonus point if they were a country that had a good personality cult, because it seems to me, bad countries, they very often, Saddam Hussein was terrific at it. He was putting up statues of himself all over the place. If you put statues up, you're definitely a personality.
That gets you a point for that, for sure.
Yeah, you definitely get an extra point. Yeah.
Wow. Now, so what's your opinion? There's been a lot of discussion lately amongst like travel blogger and podcaster types like me, because there was a big campaign for influencers to get paid to go to Saudi Arabia and speak about it as though nothing was wrong. So, do you think that people should still travel to these places? What's your thinking on that? Like, should we avoid them? What's better or what's worse?
Well, I know a friend of mine is in Saudi Arabia right now because, they've just said they're going to make visas more readily, more easily available. Whether they will longer term, I don't know. But on the day they did that, he applied for a visa instantly. And I'm pretty sure I'm waiting to hear from him. And I'm having lunch with someone who's just been there very recently, next week.
Oh, wow.
Look, I think people should go to these places and see them. I mean, I went to Saudi Arabia with my eyes wide open.
Yeah.
But I think if you're going there and you're being sort of paid to go there to say nice things about it, you have to, at the very absolute top of whatever you're saying or writing or photographing or whatever, say, I was paid to do this.
Yeah.
That if I'm influencing you, remember this is not open opinion. It's heavily paid for, subsidized advertising.
Yeah, for sure. What about the average person, like just a tourist? Do you think like people say, oh, you shouldn't go to North Korea, you're supporting that regime by being a tourist there?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question, and that was one that came up in a very major fashion in Burma, Myanmar. Lonely Planet got whacked for years about that, and we had an answer for that. And I think if you're going to a place that has bad government, you have to realize that in some way you are involved in it. Like Zimbabwe is a good example right now. That if you go to Zimbabwe, you're supporting Mugabe's regime because he may be dead, but the regime is continuing without him at the front. But on the other hand, if you go to Zimbabwe, you're putting money into the pockets of the poor everyday citizens of Zimbabwe who've suffered an awful lot and are continuing to suffer even now. And I look at, when we were being hit with all those questions about Myanmar, you could apply exactly the same questions to Tibet. And yet the Dalai Lama was saying, okay, I can't go there, but I think you should go there and, be a witness, see what's going on. So I think there's a lot to be said for being a witness to these things and, going to the places and viewing them and seeing what you see.
And like you say, also hopefully providing, if there's like some economic stimulus to the people who are suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's tricky, isn't it? Yeah.
It is tricky. And I think, that there's this view, and Donald Trump has it. He's going to punish Cuba by, as a whole series of American presidents tried to do. We're going to punish Cuba and sort Cuba out. God, why do they want to sort Cuba out? It's no worse than China, for example, or Saudi Arabia. You can say bad, as I did. You can say bad things about all those countries, but who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, it's very tricky, but interesting. Let's move on to something more cheerful. Now, you've got a new book out about the islands of Australia, and I am curious to hear. So, I'm a West Aussie through and through. So, tell me about your favourite Western Australian island.
Well, we're talking about Badlands and the bad side of it. And let's face it, Rottnest, has a really bad history to it.
Oh, true.
And for many years, that the dark side of Rottnest was sort of swept under the rug, and it isn't anymore. If you go there and you visit the little museum on Rottnest Island, it comes right out and tells you what went on there, and you're pointed towards the burial ground where Aboriginal prisoners who died on Rottnest were buried in unmarked graves. So you've got to, they've confronted that dark side of Western Australian history, and that's a good thing to see. But the island that really knocked me out for this, I was approached to do this book by the National Library because I had been to lots of islands around Australia. I'd done a lot of the groundwork already, but I did end up going to more islands because of researching the book. And the one that I just thought was far and away my favorite, or new favorite, was Dirk Hartog. I just thought it was a really interesting island. You head north of Geraldton and you can fly in there on light aircraft, but the best way to get there is go by four-wheel drive, because then you can also go out to Steep Point and claim you've been to the most westerly point in Australia.
Oh, yes.
But you go up there, and it's it's an island, but it's an outback island. When you're traveling around the island, you could be in central Australia in the outback. It's only got a handful of people living there. It's got this fascinating history from its first European explorer, Dirk Hartog, turning up to a string of subsequent Dutch and French and British explorers turning up there. It's fabulous to look at, these amazing cliffs falling into the Indian Ocean, a stretch of coastline that you would not want to be shipwrecked on.
No.
This would be if you were a Dutch navigator heading towards Batavia, Jakarta today, that would be the worst possible thing to happen to you, to be running into Dirk Hartog late one night. It gives you the shivers looking down and thinking about that. I just thought it was a great island and a really nice little resort there. The resort on the island is terrific.
Oh, awesome. I haven't been up there. I know my dad has and loved it. So it's definitely on my list.
Yeah, it should be. It's if you're in WA, it's a island not to pass up.
I will remember that and I will go and think of you, I promise. Now, I have a couple of questions that came out of the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, although the first question that I got was, can you ask him, can he adopt me? But from a travel writer who already travels a fair bit, so I don't know if she really needs you, but I thought it was a good question. But someone wanted to know about the kind of destination questions. Where is a place that you really long to return to but haven't had the chance to recently?
Oh, dear me, I haven't thought of that one for a while. I end up, for assorted reasons, going to, and this haven't been to recently because I've been to Italy earlier this year, but I do end up going to Italy just about every year, it seems. And I've possibly I haven't been back to Sicily for a long time, and I've got an invitation I got a reply to early in 2020 to go to Sicily, and Sicily's a great island. Italy's a great country to travel around. There's no way around it. And Sicily's a great island to travel around. But Italy's it's one of those countries. It's not a big country physically, but it's a big country when it comes to things to see and places to go. And there's lots of places in Italy I've not been to yet. So I could easily go back to Italy and spend more time there.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. There's lots of places I haven't been to yet that I still want to go to.
There are so many places, aren't there? It's so frustrating.
There are, yeah. You need more than one lifetime to make a serious dent into them.
It's very true. Very frustrating. What about a place that you don't want to return to? I remember at the ASTW you mentioned the Maldives, and I'm curious to know about that.
I've been whacked from that a few times. The Maldives, or I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Maldives or Maldives.
Oh, I don't know either. Yeah, sorry.
It's one or the other. I'm not sure. So we'll go back and forth. We'll call it one then the other. I was only there for a week, and I did the sort of standard. I wasn't on honeymoon, but I went to what could have been. It is a honeymoon resort. They're all honeymoon resorts, and I'm not a big enthusiast. I'm long over that. I'm not a big honeymoon resort enthusiast.
No, maybe.
And just the sort of sit there and look at the beautiful white sand and the clear water and drink another cocktail thing just does not attract me. And I think if I went back to the Maldives or Maldives, I'd do one of two things. One is I'd do the sort of backpacker approach to it, and that's travel from island to island, and not necessarily, maybe do stay in some cheap places, maybe stay in 2 or 3 cheap places, which there are some now, and you can go from island to island by ferry. Maybe a couple of days in a cheap place, a couple of days in a luxe place, a couple of days, and so actually see something of the islands. That'd be one thing. Or else, and what I should have done this last trip earlier this year was I had a week there, and it was a week in one resort, and I'd just seen enough of that resort by the end.
Yeah.
And maybe if it was a week, 3 days in one, that would have been the thing. 3 days in one resort, 3 days in another resort, and 1 day in the capital city, which everybody says is horrible. So I'd like to see it just to see if that's true or not.
Oh, I completely agree. I don't have the inclination to sit by the beach or the resort pool for days at a time, because there's all these other things I could be seeing or exploring.
Yeah,
so
and
I think
the other
seeing
thing
it with some more variety is a good approach.
Yeah, The other thing, of course, that it's famous for is the scuba diving, and I love scuba diving. So I went there thinking, well, I'll do some diving as well as lie on the beach and just sip cocktails. And the scuba diving was quite nice. But, frankly, I've done better scuba diving in Australia. I've done better scuba diving in Indonesia, a
Interesting.
place that has very good scuba diving. So who knows?
Yeah, right. No, fair enough. I tend to agree with you, actually. But, yeah, all good. Now, last question from the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. Justin asked about what he called the Lonely Planet effect. So, for example, back, a small tourism business gets mentioned in a guidebook, and then suddenly, they're overrun with people. It's not always a good thing. Do you have an opinion about that?
I do. And, I've got to say immediately, of course, that I'm 10 years away from Lonely Planet now.
Yes.
It's been a while since but I assume the policy is pretty much like the same policy that we put in when I was there. And we realized that was a problem, that you could overwhelm places. Now, it's not a problem. If you mention, one restaurant in Perth, and say this is a great restaurant, well, there's going to be a dozen other sources. There's going to be, Facebook things and TripAdvisor things and the newspapers in Perth, and there's going to be all sorts of other reasons to push you towards one restaurant or another. But there are places in the world where a guidebook, and Lonely Planet certainly had this in India, it had it in Vietnam, places where the guidebook had a lot of influence. And if you did sort of go over the top of saying this place, well, you really must eat in this restaurant, the food is so wonderful, you do run a serious risk of pointing too much attention towards it. Mm. And we realized that this was really wrong, that there could be a half dozen restaurants there. And if you say you must eat in this restaurant, people who are only there for one meal are all going to go to that one. And the other 5 out of the half dozen are not going to have anybody there at all on their first night or maybe their only night. And equally, they might all be just, one might be 5% better than the other or 5% worse. There's often not a great deal of difference. Yeah. So we learned pretty early on that if there was a place where we had a lot of influence, not to go over the top about one place, but to sort of spread that recommendation out, to say, well, this place is very nice and this one's nice and you'll really quite like that one. And maybe quite like was the key word. That was the favorite place. But no, we did learn not to overwhelm places. And we also, if there were a lot of places and you could only recommend a certain number of them, and they were all really pretty good, we'd even sort of say, okay, we're going to recommend 10 places again this time. Knock 3 out, put 3 new ones in.
Right. Yeah.
And sadly, 3. Yeah, change it around. And 3 good places might get knocked out, but probably the one that was really, really, really good would stay in. But in the rest of them, the other 9 out of 10, which were all good, 3 of them will go and 3 new ones will come in.
Oh, that's very fair and very reasonable. I'm glad you guys had that in mind. That's really good to hear.
Well, yeah, it was, but it's because we saw that effect. I've talked also at times about how, Lonely Planet was accused of ruining places. This place was okay until you came along and did a guidebook about it. And look at it now. There's all those tourists and you can't lay your towel out on the beach or that sort of thing. But I've always said we did do a guidebook to Afghanistan back when there was a little window of opportunity and we thought Afghanistan might be coming back and getting back on the tourist radar again. And we only ever did 1 edition of the book, and it never sold that number of copies. But it was a great book to do, and I know people who used it loved it. But I would love to be able to say, "Oh, I ruined Afghanistan." Yeah. If I could claim I ruined everything, it wasn't true. It wasn't perfect there, but we got along with the Taliban. But then Lonely Planet came in, and that was the kiss of disaster. Ruined the country. If I could ruin Afghanistan, I would.
That would be the pinnacle of your career.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's awesome. I just have one more quick question. So, obviously this is the Thoughtful Travel podcast, so it's all about trying to travel a bit more thoughtfully. So what do you think is, kind of the key way to be key ways to be a thoughtful traveller?
I think a number of things. The whole flight flight shame thing that's going on, particularly in Europe. And I was intrigued at one thing I read recently, someone saying, well, it's fine for people in Sweden to say, you shouldn't fly there, take the train. They can jump on a train and they can be in a day or so in Paris. We don't have, if we're in Australia, we don't have that option. So I think, we're going to have to think about flying, and we're going to have to limit it in some ways. But I think in Europe, this thing of, well, it's the weekend, where shall I fly to? I'll leave on Friday night and I'll be back on Sunday lunchtime sort of thing. I really think that's going over the top at times. But, we should put a little more time and effort into places. So I think, overconsumption of travel is not a good thing. I think that you should always try and be aware of the place you're going to, and go there with an open mind about what you're going to experience and what you hope to learn from it. And I must admit, I sometimes go to places and I really haven't read up on the place before I get there, but I have got the information source with me, and I'll probably be reading some on the plane, and then reading a lot more while I'm there, and then reading even more when I get back. So having an interest in the place you're going to is really important. And I think we do need today to be looking at the footprint we do have, and I think there are lots of questions about that we have still to answer. I must admit, I'm very skeptical about Qantas's current push towards doing these ultra long haul flights. It's been. I just don't think it's a good idea. I think it might be very nice to fly non-stop from Sydney to New York or whatever, but I'm willing to bet that it's a much less environmentally friendly thing than stopping somewhere en route. All the Qantas talk on this has been, talking about the jet lag and the food and the exercise and so on. Not once have they mentioned the environmental footprint of this. And I would like to see. I'm sort of investigating it, and I'm pushing a few other people to investigate it some more. I'd like to see some more real facts and figures on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think if it was something that was environmentally sensible, they would be promoting the heck out of that aspect of it. So,
and it's not at all. I don't think it is in one way. Yeah.
Exactly. I agree. Yeah. It's heartening to see, even just in the last 12 months, how much these kind of issues have come to the forefront. So I think we're at a time when it's really changing.
There will more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And certainly my philosophy is travel less frequently but longer.
It's nice. 12 months would be a good trip length, wouldn't it?
Oh, well,
12 months every year.
Yes, that would be fabulous. I'd be willing to stay in just one place for 12 months if I got to go to another one the next 12 months. But, it's annoying how these other things get in the way, like, my son's schooling or, having to pay bills and stuff. But, we'll get through that. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, Tony. It's been fabulous to talk to you today. So there you go. Lots of interesting stuff, lots of words of wisdom from Tony Wheeler. Thanks so much to the lovely Thoughtful Travellers from the Facebook group who also supplied a last few of those questions. That was really handy to be able to get your input and to see. I hope you're happy and satisfied with the answers. So thank you very much for listening to episode 163 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. If you want to know more about Tony, I actually highly recommend his own website, which is at tonywheeler.com.au. He runs a blog there with just fabulous tales and photos from his recent travels because he just doesn't stop. He's always somewhere in the world. So I highly recommend having a look at that. Do come along too and join the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. Come and chat to us there. I'll put some pictures and other links in the show notes, including, of course, there's a picture with me and Tony Wheeler and a couple of my travel writing buddies, just to prove I really met him. You'll find the show notes for this episode at notaballerina.com/163, along with a transcript from the show as well. Now, don't forget, I am shooting for 250,000 downloads in 2019, so please help me out by spreading the word. Perhaps if you particularly enjoyed this interview with Tony Wheeler, you might like to share that one with some friends and fellow like-minded travellers. As always, thank you very much for listening.
This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.